The situation in the Middle East is serious. There's been an escalation. The Navy is tracking multiple inbound threats. We are prepared to respond with overwhelming force. At precisely 3:42 in the afternoon, as the afternoon sun began its descent over one of the busiest maritime corridors on Earth, the Combat Information Center aboard the USS Sterett suddenly transformed from routine vigilance into controlled urgency. Across multiple screens, 18 distinct signatures materialized almost simultaneously, each one representing an anti-ship missile skimming low above the water, each one hurtling directly toward the American formation at speeds exceeding 600 miles per hour. There was no advance warning broadcast to the world, no diplomatic protest filed hours before, no measured press release announcing hostile intent. There was only the raw data streaming across tactical displays and a crew whose training was about to be tested against live ordnance. According to documented accounts from defense analysts and naval intelligence sources monitoring the Gulf of Aden, this was no random act of provocation. What was unfolding was a deliberate, orchestrated assault designed by Houthi forces to saturate American defenses and shatter the perception that U.S. naval power in these waters remained untouchable. The sheer volume of the attack, 18 missiles launched in a compressed window from multiple dispersed locations along Yemen's coastline, represented something more than aggression. It represented calculation, a mathematical bet that somewhere in that barrage, at least one projectile would slip through and transform a defensive success into a strategic humiliation. As those missiles closed the distance with every passing second, the question hanging over the entire engagement was simple yet profound. Would the layers of technology, training, and preparation built over decades be enough to stop what was coming? Before we continue with the full breakdown of what happened next and how this confrontation reshaped the conversation around modern naval warfare, make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications so you don't miss the critical details that follow. The USS Abraham Lincoln Carrier Strike Group was not conducting a leisurely transit through neutral waters. It was positioned with purpose in one of the most strategically vital maritime corridors on the planet. A narrow passage where the Red Sea meets the Gulf of Aden, where roughly 15% of global trade flows through waters barely wide enough to separate continents. Every tanker carrying fuel from the Persian Gulf, every container ship connecting Asian manufacturing hubs to European markets, every vessel moving goods that keep economies functioning passes through these waters. A disruption here does not remain local. It ripples across stock exchanges, supply chains, and fuel prices within hours. The destroyer USS Sterett, an Arleigh Burke-class guided missile destroyer equipped with the Aegis Combat System, was serving as the forward defensive shield for this carrier group. Nearby, the USS Ralph Johnson maintained a complementary position, creating overlapping fields of fire and sensor coverage that together formed a protective envelope around the carrier and its air wing. These ships were not simply floating through contested waters, hoping for the best. They were actively engaged in what naval strategists describe as sea control, projecting presence in a region where hostile actors had repeatedly demonstrated willingness to challenge international navigation. On the opposite shore, in the mountainous terrain of Houthi-controlled Yemen, commanders aligned with Iran had been observing this American presence with growing ambition. For months, these forces had launched attacks against commercial shipping, targeting vessels with drones and missiles in what they characterized as solidarity with Palestinian civilians during the conflict in Gaza. But the calculus was always broader than any single cause. Each attack tested international resolve. Each successful strike against a merchant ship demonstrated capability, and each incident that forced shipping companies to reroute around the Cape of Good Hope added billions in costs to global trade. Yet attacking commercial vessels was one thing. Attacking a U.S. Navy destroyer screening a nuclear-powered aircraft carrier was something else entirely. What Houthi commanders apparently believed was that by concentrating enough firepower in a single moment, they could overwhelm American defenses through sheer volume rather than technological superiority. If even one missile penetrated the defensive screen, the images alone would reverberate through every capital watching this confrontation unfold. American intelligence, however, had been observing preparations on the ground for days. Satellite imagery showed activity at multiple launch sites. Communications intercepts revealed coordination patterns inconsistent with random militia activity. The question facing American commanders was not whether an attack was coming, but when it would arrive and how it would be structured. The answer came at 3:42 that afternoon, and it came with 18 missiles racing toward their formation simultaneously. In the hours and days leading up to the attack, the atmosphere aboard American warships operating in the Gulf of Aden had already shifted into a heightened state of readiness that most civilian observers would never perceive from the outside. There were no dramatic announcements, no visible changes to the silhouette of the ships as they maintained their patrol routes, no indication to commercial vessels passing nearby that anything unusual was developing. Yet below decks, inside the nerve centers of these destroyers, the posture had changed. American surveillance systems monitoring Yemen's coastline had detected a pattern of activity that intelligence analysts recognized immediately. Thermal signatures increased at multiple locations simultaneously, suggesting equipment activation rather than routine storage. Communications traffic that normally appeared scattered and irregular began clustering into dense, rhythmic bursts that revealed coordination rather than coincidence. Vehicle movements near known launch sites followed patterns that matched preparation timelines observed in previous incidents. None of these indicators alone would constitute certainty. But together, they painted a picture that experienced analysts had seen before, the signature of an impending coordinated strike. This kind of pre-attack intelligence represents one of the most crucial and least understood aspects of modern naval warfare. Defense does not begin when missiles appear on radar screens. It begins when the first subtle anomaly is detected, cataloged, and cross-referenced against historical patterns. It continues through the progressive tightening of defensive postures, the repositioning of assets, the pre-authorization of response protocols that remove hesitation from critical moments. By the time a missile actually launches, the defending force should already be in motion, already anticipating, already prepared to execute decisions that were made long before the immediate threat materialized. What makes this phase so strategically important is what it reveals about an adversary's capabilities and limitations. If defenders can detect preparations in advance, they gain the option to preempt or to observe. Preemption removes the immediate threat but teaches the attacker nothing about what went wrong. Observation allows the attack to proceed, gathering invaluable intelligence about launch sites, command structures, and coordination methods that would otherwise remain concealed. The decision between these approaches is never simple. It weighs immediate risk against long-term advantage, potential casualties against potential knowledge, the politics of appearing passive against the operational benefits of comprehensive understanding. In this case, American commanders chose to maintain their defensive posture without launching preemptive strikes against the launch sites they had identified. Whether this reflected a deliberate decision to gather intelligence or simply the standard rules of engagement that require hostile action before responsive force remains classified. What is certain is that when those 18 missiles finally rose from their launchers, American forces were not surprised. They were waiting. The structure of the attack itself revealed sophisticated planning by Houthi commanders who clearly understood the theoretical limits of shipboard missile defense. Launching from 6 separate locations spread along the coastline, the missiles approached from slightly different vectors, creating a problem that defense systems had to solve in parallel rather than sequentially. Each tracking radar has finite bandwidth. Each interceptor missile takes time to launch, acquire its target, and complete its engagement. By dispersing launch points, the attackers hoped to force the defending ships to divide their attention, potentially creating gaps in coverage that a single concentrated salvo would not exploit. The timing compression added another layer of pressure. All 18 missiles were airborne within a window narrow enough that the earliest intercepts and the latest threats would overlap, preventing the defenders from calmly addressing one target before moving to the next. This was not amateur rocketeering. This was a deliberate attempt to apply the mathematical logic of saturation against the most advanced naval air defense system in the world. Anti-ship missiles flying at low altitude over water present a particularly challenging intercept problem. The curvature of the Earth limits radar detection range when targets are hugging the surface. By the time a ship-based radar can reliably track a sea-skimming missile, the engagement window has already compressed significantly. At 600 miles per hour, a missile detected at 30 miles will arrive in approximately 3 minutes. In that window, the defending ship must confirm the track, classify the threat, assign an interceptor, launch, guide that interceptor to impact, and verify destruction before moving to the next target. When 18 threats appear simultaneously, those 3 minutes become a precisely choreographed sequence where every second of delay cascades through the entire defensive response. Yet aboard the USS Sterett and across the networked formation, the response unfolded with a rhythm that surprised external observers expecting chaos. Standard Missile-2 interceptors began rising from vertical launch cells before the full scope of the attack was even confirmed. The Aegis Combat System, designed specifically for this kind of multi-target engagement, automatically distributed tracking resources across the threat picture, assigning illumination radars and interceptor missiles according to algorithms refined over decades of development and real-world testing. The crew executed their roles with a precision that reflected endless drills conducted during peacetime, training that exists specifically for moments like this one. The layered defense concept that defines American surface combatant design proved its worth in practice. SM-2 missiles engaged threats at extended range. Evolved Sea Sparrow missiles provided a secondary layer for anything that penetrated the outer zone. The Phalanx close-in weapon system stood ready as the final backstop, its radar and Gatling gun designed to shred any missile that somehow survived the previous layers. This architecture exists precisely because single-point-of-failure systems invite disaster in combat. By providing multiple independent opportunities to defeat each incoming threat, designers accepted that any individual layer might fail while ensuring that complete defensive failure becomes statistically improbable. One by one, the 18 missiles were tracked, engaged, and destroyed. No American ship was struck, no sailors were wounded, no damage was recorded. The barrage that was supposed to demonstrate American vulnerability instead demonstrated the opposite. The defensive systems worked, the training held, the coordinated assault dissolved into debris falling into the Gulf of Aden without ever threatening the ships it was intended to destroy. What happened next would prove even more consequential than the defense itself. While the final intercepts were still completing overhead, a parallel process had already begun within the American command network. The counterstrike did not require debate or improvisation. It required only execution. For months, American intelligence had been mapping the Houthi military infrastructure that enabled attacks against shipping and naval forces. Satellite imagery had cataloged launch sites. Signals intelligence had traced communications between command centers and field units. Human intelligence had filled gaps in the electronic picture. By the time those 18 missiles lifted off from Yemen's coastline, the American military possessed comprehensive target lists that represented not random retaliation, but systematic elimination of the capability that generated the threat. The response began within minutes of the final intercept. Strike aircraft that had already been airborne shifted from patrol patterns to attack vectors. Long-range cruise missiles initiated their navigation sequences toward pre-programmed coordinates. The operation unfolded with a precision that reflected its pre-planned nature, each weapon system executing its assigned role in a sequence designed not merely to punish, but to degrade. According to defense reporting and independent conflict monitors, the strikes that followed targeted 8 Houthi military installations in rapid succession. Radar sites that had provided targeting data for previous attacks went silent. Underground storage facilities that housed missile components were collapsed. Command centers that coordinated operations between dispersed units were demolished. Training compounds where personnel learned to operate sophisticated Iranian-supplied weapons were rendered unusable. The strikes were not scattered across random locations. They were concentrated against the specific infrastructure that made coordinated missile attacks possible. The scale of the American response corresponded directly to the scale of the attack it answered. 256 separate weapons were employed across the target set, each one directed at a component of the network that had launched those 18 missiles hours earlier. This number was not arbitrary. It reflected the comprehensive intelligence picture that had been assembled over months of observation and analysis. Every target had been validated. Every aim point had been refined. The margin between sufficient force and excessive force had been calculated and approved through a process that existed precisely to prevent emotion from driving military decisions. What distinguished this response from previous exchanges in the Red Sea was its integrated nature. Previous American strikes had focused on individual launch sites or isolated radar positions, tactical responses to tactical provocations. This operation dismantled connected systems rather than isolated assets. When detection capabilities are destroyed alongside command facilities, alongside launch equipment, alongside training infrastructure, the entire network loses coherence. Surviving elements cannot simply relocate and resume operations. They must rebuild from a degraded foundation, a process that consumes time, resources, and expertise that cannot be easily replaced. The speed of the operation carried its own message. 31 minutes elapsed between the launch of the Houthi missiles and the conclusion of the American counterstrike. That timeline was not accidental. It demonstrated that American forces could absorb a coordinated assault without disruption, while simultaneously executing a devastating response against the source of that assault. There was no period of uncertainty while commanders debated options. There was no delay while target lists were assembled from scratch. The preparation had been completed in advance. The attack merely provided authorization to proceed. Casualty reports from Houthi-controlled areas suggested substantial personnel losses among military units caught in the strikes. While precise figures remain difficult to verify independently given the operational security environment in Yemen, the pattern of strikes against command facilities and training compounds indicated that experienced leadership and specialized technical personnel were among those affected. This represents a different category of damage than destroyed equipment. Equipment can be replaced through continued Iranian supply chains. Trained operators who understand how to employ that equipment effectively require years to develop. In contrast, American forces reported no casualties and no damage across the entire engagement. Ships that had absorbed the incoming missile barrage continued their patrol routes without interruption. Aircraft that had executed strike missions returned to their carriers and prepared for subsequent operations. The asymmetry between the two sides of this confrontation could not have been more stark. One side launched 18 missiles and lost 8 military installations. The other side destroyed 18 missiles and lost nothing. The implications of this engagement extend far beyond the waters where it occurred. For years, analysts had debated whether American naval forces could defend themselves against coordinated missile attacks from dispersed, low-cost adversaries. This debate intensified as Houthi forces demonstrated increasing sophistication in their weapons and tactics throughout the Red Sea crisis. Skeptics argued that the mathematics of saturation would eventually favor attackers who could produce missiles more cheaply than defenders could produce interceptors. Defenders of the current architecture insisted that training, integration, and tactical proficiency could overcome numerical disadvantages. This engagement provided evidence for one side of that debate. 18 missiles launched simultaneously from 6 locations against a prepared formation of American destroyers achieved exactly 0 penetrations. Every threat was tracked, every threat was engaged, every threat was destroyed. The defensive systems performed as designed under conditions that represented exactly the kind of stress test that skeptics had predicted would expose their limitations. For observers across the region, particularly those in capitals considering whether to challenge American naval presence through similar asymmetric means, The lesson was unmistakable. Volume alone does not guarantee success against defended targets. Coordination without capability produces impressive displays that nonetheless fail to achieve their operational objectives. The gap between launching an attack and successfully striking a defended target remains vast, and that gap cannot be closed simply by increasing the number of projectiles fired. Perhaps most significantly, the engagement demonstrated what happens after an attack fails. The response that followed was not a symbolic gesture designed to satisfy domestic audiences. It was a systematic degradation of the capabilities that enabled the original assault. Future attacks of similar scale would require rebuilding infrastructure that no longer existed, training replacement personnel who no longer had instructors, and coordinating through networks that had been severed. The price of attempting to overwhelm American defenses proved far higher than the cost of anything those defenses expended in stopping the incoming missiles. As commercial shipping continues to navigate these contested waters and geopolitical tensions continue to simmer across the broader region, the events of that afternoon stand as a reference point for what happens when theoretical challenges to American naval power meet the reality of American naval capability. The missiles flew, the defenses held, the response arrived, and when the final assessments were compiled, one side had demonstrated strength while the other had revealed the limits of its reach. The question that remains is not whether such attacks will be attempted again. History suggests they will. The question is whether those planning future assaults will calculate differently after watching what happened when 18 missiles raced toward American warships and found nothing but their own destruction waiting at the end of their flight paths. What unfolded in the Gulf of Aden did not conclude with the last interceptor finding its target or the final strike munition impacting its assigned coordinates. The confrontation opened a window into how modern naval warfare actually functions when theory meets practice, when calculated provocation encounters prepared response, and when the mathematics of saturation collide with the reality of integrated defense. For the Houthi forces who authorized the attack, the aftermath represented something more damaging than any single tactical defeat. The infrastructure that enabled sophisticated coordinated strikes had been systematically degraded. Launch sites that had taken months to establish were gone. Command relationships that connected field units to central leadership had been severed. Personnel with irreplaceable expertise had been eliminated. The capability to repeat an attack of similar scale would require rebuilding from a foundation that no longer existed, a process measured in months or years rather than days. For American forces, the engagement validated both doctrine and investment. Decades of development had produced systems capable of handling exactly the scenario that unfolded. Training programs had prepared crews to execute defensive procedures under exactly the conditions they faced. Intelligence architecture had provided advance warning that enabled measured preparation rather than surprised improvisation. The entire enterprise functioned as designed, not because of luck or favorable circumstances, but because of systematic effort directed toward precisely this outcome. For the broader audience watching these events unfold, including regional powers evaluating their own options and commercial interests calculating their own risks, the message embedded in those 31 minutes was explicit without requiring translation. Attacking American naval forces carries costs that extend far beyond the immediate engagement. The price is not measured only in missiles expended or installations destroyed. It is measured in capability degraded, in timelines extended, in plans disrupted, and in strategic calculations revised. What happened in the Gulf of Aden was never simply about 18 missiles and their interception. It was about demonstrating that American power in contested waters rests on foundations too deep to shake with a single coordinated assault. The response did not seek escalation. It sought conclusion. It removed the immediate threat while eliminating the means to regenerate that threat quickly. And then it stopped, leaving the initiative in American hands while forcing others to reconsider whether their assumptions about vulnerability had ever been accurate. The waters of the Red Sea and Gulf of Aden will remain contested. Shipping will continue to flow through passages that hostile actors wish to control. Confrontations will continue to occur as competing interests collide in spaces too strategically vital to abandon. But when those confrontations occur, they will occur in the shadow of this engagement, a reminder that challenges to American naval power do not simply test defenses. They invite responses that reshape the conditions under which future challenges become possible. Now we turn the question to you. Having seen what happens when concentrated fire meets layered defense, when coordinated assault meets prepared response, when hostile intent meets overwhelming capability, what lessons do you draw from those 31 minutes? Leave your thoughts in the comments below. And if you want to stay informed about how power is exercised, challenged, and demonstrated in waters that shape global affairs, subscribe now and join us for the next breakdown of the moments that define modern military competition.